Hello everyone and welcome to Janet's Craft Corner. Today we are going to make one of the welcome winter farmhouse signs. We're going to do the polar bear warm winter wishes sign. So I've already painted the background of my square in the light blue color that I wanted because I want to do some dotting in this paint, and so to do that I have to have the base of that has to be extremely dry, or very dry, I shouldn't say extremely, very dry, to keep it from peeling as I try to do the dotting. And I am using a stylus to do dotting, but you can use the end of a brush or anything that has got a rounded end. A lot of times I'll use the end of a small brush, but all you have to do is you're going to dip it in your paint, and you do not want to touch the bottom of your palette. So dip it in your paint and then you touch it onto the piece that you're dotting. So I'm going to touch it on here, and I'm just going to, the idea is for them to look somewhat random. I don't do random very well, as you probably know by now. So I kind of do a pattern, but it looks kind of random when you get all done, especially since I don't pay any attention to the pieces that are going to be put on between or on top of these dots. So that'll make the whole thing look somewhat random. I am going to skip down here and see what happens when you touch your palette. I am going to skip down here because that large piece there is going to cover the whole thing, so I don't need to dot underneath it very much at all. But it's the whole side to side. But the dotting is just a simple dip it in there and put it on there. If you want them to be less uniform in size, you can just do one or two at a time, 3 or 4 if you got enough paint on there. It just depends on how much paint you have on them. I tend to like them to be somewhat uniform. They're never perfectly uniform because it's a dot. You're just dipping and dotting, and it's not going to be perfectly uniform. But if you want them to be less uniform than this, then first of all you need a thicker one than I've got out, because I have a relatively thin stylus out. But you need a thicker one to start with, so you got a little bit more paint on it. And then you need to just do more than one hit each time. More than one dot on your piece each time, each dip into the paint. Usually I paint my white ahead of time for you, so you don't have to sit, and because white has to dry, it takes a lot. It takes multiple coats for white, so it takes a little longer usually than the other. But because I had to do dotting today, I didn't do any of my white painting, so I'm going to show you all of that today. So for right now, we're just going to do our dots. So that is how you dot on a piece, so that you've got a dot background. And in this case, it's going to make it look like it's snowing behind everything. And we're going to add a couple of snowflakes to even improve that look a little bit more. And I'm actually going to move this over here out of the way, because if I leave it over there, then I can pretty much guarantee you that I'll end up with my sleeve in it and we will have a mess. Okay. So then we're going to do all this up here as white also. And so I'm going to first of all do the bigger pieces, and I'm going to use a brush on them. I could use the sponge, and I kind of recommend that for everybody else, but I have fibromyalgia, so the up and down of a sponge is harder on me than using a brush. So I'm going to actually offload that a little bit. So I'm going to use the brush on as much as I can, especially since right now my fibromyalgia is a little bit flared up. And I'm going to try to keep it as controlled as we possibly can keep it. So we're just painting them pretty easy, pretty simple paints. I mean, none of these are hard. As you probably have learned, nothing that I do is very hard. I think probably the hardest things are either scarves, which we're going to do one here, or candy canes, those kind of things that there's just no way to have multiple pieces. And so you have to actually follow along and do that. And I'm going to be stuck to this big time here. Too big a board. got a little bit down in this little crevice here, so I'm going to use another brush. Actually, it looks like I did it on both sides, to kind of clean that out so that I don't have to worry about trying to use it to trim it later, because that's the small area where I go trim that. As I try to always show you, you want to start in the middle of your piece and work your way out to edges, because that will help you have clean edges so that you don't have to do too much trimming up of those edges. You can when you're all done, if you've got where it went over and you kind of have a mess along your sides or whatever and you want to clean them up, you can use black paint or a black marker to clean them up, and it'll match the burn edge that they have. But you can avoid that, or avoid a lot of that, by just working from the outside or from the inside. Make sure you got that right. Working from the inside to the outside of your piece. If you work from the outside in, you'll end up with globs along the edges every time your brush comes onto the piece. And when you get pieces like this, where there's these small areas up top, that it's kind of hard. Sometimes end up having to do a little bit of trimming up there, but again, it's very hard to trim up there, so I try to keep an extra brush close so that I can do like I'm doing now and clean them up as I go. And that way I won't have to do any trimming up there, because it's almost impossible to trim those little bitty small spaces like that. And with white, you've always got to worry about your brush strokes, because white shows the brush strokes pretty badly. But if you gently come onto your piece, it'll be fine. And I put a pretty good coat on all of that. I'm actually going to let that dry for a little bit while I do the sponge painting. And the sponge painting, it's pretty simple. You just get the bottom of your sponge, you dip it in the paint, and when you're sponge painting, you want your sponge to not look like this. Can you see those? Hopefully you can see that. The lumps in that paint, that's way too much paint on the sponge. You want to offload your sponge onto your palette or onto a piece of paper, a paper towel off the side, and so that your sponge has very little paint on it, and therefore no lumps, as you can see there. It's just really smooth, and it doesn't take much paint. The smaller the amount of paint, the less edge you'll have. When you do sponge paint, you still get a little bit of an edge, but it will be a very uniform, it'll be a very small edge and a very uniform edge. And like I said, the more you offload your paint and the lighter you press, the less your edge will be. And you'll notice I'm going over a couple of these smaller pieces with the sponge now, because it'll save me having to do the brush the second time. The brush puts a little thicker coat of paint on than the sponge does. So that means a little less on the required coats, and this way I don't have to go back over it with the brush. I still will have to go back over the bear himself probably with the brush, but I don't have to do the rest of them. You do want to use sponges. There's two reasons you might want to use the sponge painting technique. One is small pieces that you just can't avoid the edges of, and you want to keep your edges as clean as possible, which is why we're using it today. The other is you've got engraved score marks that you want to show through. There's lots of score marks that are used just for identifying where you need to put your pieces when you glue them together. But there are some that are made to actually show through. And so when you have ones that are made to show through, and in this case, like the little one in the middle of his nose is made to show through, or well, I guess it's not really his nose, middle of his face, I guess, is made to show through. So you want to try to leave that as clean as possible. If you do fill it in accidentally, or if it just fills itself in, then you can clean it out. If it's a straight line like that, you can clean it out with an X-Acto knife. And so I'm going to go ahead and go back over the sponge again, since I've got the sponge right now and it's wet and it's working. You do always have to go over sponge painting at least twice, no matter what color you use. And honestly, a lot of times with the lighter colors like this, you may have to go 3 times with the sponge paint, because you do want that paint layer to be really, really thin so it doesn't end up seeping down on your edges. But as long as you keep your paint thin on your sponge and you keep your pressure thin, it doesn't really matter how many times you go over it, your edges will still be very clean. Okay, then I left my brush out so that I could come back and do the polar bear, him again, put another coat on him. I did kind of go back and get a little bit of a second coat when I was doing it, because you can kind of go back a little bit, not too much though, because if your first layer is still wet, then a lot of times putting another layer on will actually remove the first layer, not add a layer. Kind of pick it up, move it off. And I will warn you, we don't have that color in this one, but yellow is one that always does that. You gotta make sure, you really gotta make sure you get the yellow good and dry, because it always wants to pick up the next layer, the lower layer. For some reason. And I'm gonna do that. I think it's enough on him, but I'm gonna do one more coat of the sponge painting. At least on some of it I am, because I notice it's still light. Okie doke. And then we're going to do our 2 little teeny weeny ones. We've got red and we've got black there. So we're going to do both of those real quick. The black is so small, even though I normally would do my black with a brush, because it doesn't matter how much you get down on your edges. It is so small. I'm going to actually do it with the sponge too, so it's easier. And see, that actually is not going to need 2 coats, it's just going to need the 1. And the red, I think we'll just do that too. Actually, that paint is really, really thin, so I think I'm going to do it with the brush. Arts are pretty easy to do with a brush. They're basically just one stroke out from the middle on each side. As thin as this paint is, it would take multiple coats. Now I'm going to get my scarf, and I'm going to do my scarf. I'm going to do it half light blue and half, or light blue stripes and pink stripes, I think is what I'm going to do. You can do whatever color you want. Because I had light blue out, I thought I would do light blue, and then I actually don't still have the light blue out, but that's okay. We're going to still use it. We're going to go with that one. On stripes like this, the best size brush you can use is a brush that is slightly smaller than the area you're trying to paint, and I may not have one. It might work. Okay. You want it to be a little more than half the size of the area you're painting, but you would like for it to be less than 1 full width of the area you're painting, so that you don't end up with it wanting to go down in between. And then you're just gonna, just do it gently. It is harder when you're when you're on edges. I find, at least. And you do a lot of with painting the stripes. I do a lot of turning my palette around so that I'm always coming from the middle of my stripe out, and I'm along an edge, and so. Pull it gently along that edge, and then switch over and pull it gently along this edge, and that keeps it within those lines. The lines are a little thicker because I use the higher setting on the laser, so that they dig in a little bit more, so that they are less likely to bleed between them, to try to help you a little bit. But you want to keep your brush somewhat unloaded. You you don't want to get too much on your brush, but you also don't want too little on your brush. You won't be able to pull the whole straight up. The string up. The hardest part is always the part that's along edges where they goes both directions. Like here, yep, I gotta go along that edge while still maintaining this edge over here. That's always the hardest part. And I've found with stripes, you almost always have to do them two coats, because you never put too much pressure. You don't want it to spread too far from your end of your brush, so you never put very much pressure on them. So you end up having to usually do 2 coats on stripes. Then on stripes, experience has taught me to almost always, well, actually I'm not gonna. I try to go up and down more than I go across sideways. But these are so thin, I think I'm gonna go sideways. Because these are thinner than those up there, this brush is almost as thick as these individual stripes. So I have to be very careful not to spread my bristles too much, or I end up with them in the next stripe. This is another place you've got to be careful when you've got another piece right up against this one. It's not very far between these 2 pieces. You need to make sure that you stop your brush quickly when pulling off, because you don't want to go onto the next piece and end up getting paint on the edge of it. So when you're doing a paint board, make sure you spread your pieces out. But you know, in this case, I can't. There's nothing I can do about it. They're attached. And if you can see, my hand's all over the white. But luckily, acrylic dries really, really fast, so it's dry up here. I do want to make sure if I'm not going up and down, I'm always pulling towards my dominant hand, towards my painting hand. So in my case, I'm going from the left to the right because I'm right-handed. And the brush is in my right hand. Let that dry. Well, I let that dry good because I want to have it as dry as possible between the 2 pieces, between the 2 colors. I'm going to paint my tree. And obviously, it's a fir tree, so the tree is green. Like I said, you always want to go from the center out, so I'm working my way down each of these branches, coming out and trying to be careful along that outer edge where I'm not quite 100% moving off the paint, off the piece. So I'm kind of running along the edge of it. And this is a tree, something in nature that, you know, is not going to have a solid color. So I'm actually doing my 2 or 3 coats, whatever you think it needs to be, as I go, because if I end up with some little splotches, it's okay. Because the tree, that just, you know, it's a bare spot in the tree. And the trunk of our tree is brown, and we're going to actually paint it brown, and then we're going to basically do a faux stain on this piece. I'll show you how to do that. And then to do the faux stain, you can actually do one of 2 things. You can either mix a lot of water with your paint and use then a brush to put it on, but you want to thin your paint out a lot. Or this way, to me, works a lot quicker and easier. You use a wet wipe and you take and you dip it in your paint and then you just smear it on, and it's going to thin it out because you got the water from the wet wipe, and it's going to just spread. You're going to spread it out across the whole piece, and you want to try to get it, you know, kind of an even color as much as possible. For me, I tend to let the bottom dip in, and so my bottom was getting thinner than my top. And you can do it as thick or as thin as you want. So there's that. And actually, that's a little, to me, thick. So now I'm turning the piece over, the wet wipe over, and getting an area of it that doesn't have any paint on it, and kind of cleaning it off a little bit, so that it's a little lighter and more of a staple. Okay, and then we got one more here. We got our pink stripes there, and then and we got some pink here, so we'll show you how to do that. We got some pink on our little bear that makes his cheeks and his ears. So we're going to do our stripes first. One of my favorite combinations is actually the light blue and a lavender, but since I have to have the pink, I'm using the pink for his cheeks, I decided to not use the extra color on it this time, which is why I'm doing pink and blue. So you can do it in any color combination you want. Heck, you could do it in dark blue and dark green if you want. It's not me. I don't like the dark colors as well. I like the pastels. I like the light colors, especially during the winter. I want it to be bright and cheery. I guess I could do red and white, or orange and white, or something like that. That would make it bright and cheery. But, my winter stuff, I want to be as bright and cheery as possible. If you don't know how to make a paint board, look for the Technique Tuesday videos, and one of them shows you how to make a paint board. They're not hard. Really, really simple, but they make it a whole lot easier to paint a piece such as the little bitty pieces, especially because it holds them still while you paint. So you don't have to try to find a way to hold on to this and keep your hands out of the paint, and it's always a challenge. Because this is a knitted scarf. This was a candy cane, I wouldn't be quite as liberal with this. But because it's a knitted scarf, and if you've ever knitted, you know that the two colors kind of merge together. There's not a hard delineation between them. So I'm painting a little basically right into these crevices here with my second color. So, and maybe just a little over them, so that it's kind of merging a little cleaner than leaving that crevice between them. So I feel like it looks better that way. But you can do it however you want. Another easy way to do stripes like this is to use markers. Acrylic markers are wonderful. You can get them so you can fill them with your own paint if you want. But I don't have any of those kind. I have a set of Thule markers that I use that it's got like every color in this rainbow. And we're going underneath there, so we can kind of use that area to drag into and kind of make a little circle. And then we're going to do one over here too. Needs a little bit of a wet wipe on those. I went down just a little further than I intended. Okay, and then one last little detail. There's it's time to assemble, but before we assemble, I'm going to drive you all nuts, and I'm going to actually use the hot air on this for a little bit, because dots take longer to dry, and so while most of this is dry, I'm going to use the hot air on it real quick, and then I'll come back, and I'm going to kind of turn the sound off while I do this. Okay, I'm back. Okay, using the heat gun on dots, by the way, will only dry the outer layer of those dots. It does not dry down under, so you do need to still be a little bit careful. So we're going to start our assembly, and just start where you want. I usually start at the top and kind of work left, top to bottom, left to right. So I'm going to put my little sign up there, which says Warm Winter Wishes. It's going to use my letters that I have made. And there are outlines on here so you can know where it kind of goes. On snowflakes, I don't usually do every piece of it. I just do the center, the two center pieces. The glue's strong enough, that'll be plenty to hold it. Even with dots under. With dots under, you do need to press down a little bit so you make sure that your glue connects. Generally speaking, I'm not doing much trimming on these, but I don't know if you can see that. On the edge of that ear, I've got a little bit of a glob, so I'm going to trim that out. I'm going to trim on that area right there, but that's the only trimming I'm really doing. I'm not doing much. If you're careful when you paint, you really shouldn't have to do much at all. And he's going to look funny. He looks like his cheeks are just huge, but they're not because of that piece that's going to go on top of them here in a second. You want to do basically one layer at a time. So you do your bottom layer and get all your bottom layer pieces in, and then you work your way up. Okay, there we go. We've got all of our bottom pieces on, and then again, I'm not going to do every piece of this. I'm going to make sure I get the outer two, and then I'm kind of going to put some dots here and there along some of these others. But I want the outside edges is what I want to make sure I do a good job of, because they're the ones that'll they'll do the most of your holding. This font is pretty thin. I think it's really pretty, but it's mixed for some thin spots, so you gotta be very careful. It's easy to break them. But I will tell you, if you do break one, don't panic. Usually you can glue it, since it's being glued down onto something else, you can glue it back together. Before I put this on, I'm going to actually do a little bit of snow. I get my sponge out here again, and I'm just going to touch some edges here. So it looks like I got a little bit of snow on my branches. Again, this is a little easier to do with the dauber, but I didn't pull one out today, so we're doing it with the regular sponge. But, you know, it's okay because it's not, okay, first of all, this is homemade, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And secondly, we're just doing edging. And so I'm actually going to do kind of down in the middle a little bit, because I want it to look kind of like it's got snow on it. What I want my tree to look like. And so I'm just kind of using my sponge. But the thing you got to be careful of. So I've got some edges here, so just take your sponge and turn it over and use the other end and drag them out a little bit. They're still got a little bit more than I want there. That's okay. We'll make do with this because it's going to be just fine because it's homemade. People don't expect homemade to be perfect. You don't want it to be perfect because then it doesn't look like it's homemade. See, we add this on here, and now his cheeks don't look so bad. They really were kind of overwhelming there for a little bit, weren't they? So if you're like me and you have trouble with the little bitty pieces, sometimes I will take, and instead of doing it as a little piece, I will do it as use the marker to fill it in and not have the piece on top there. But this is not that little. I do that a lot with doorknobs. I don't know why people think we want to cut the doorknob separate, but sometimes they do. I guess technically, I guess the doorknob would stick out, so that's probably why, but... And there we go. Warm winter wishes. This is a farmhouse, one of our farmhouse signs, and so you can actually use it to put it in with a farmhouse frame or on one of the breadboards, a lot of different display units, or you can just set it up with a couple of little easel feet. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and we'll come back and join us again soon. Thanks for stopping by.